the panel as a whole. I think there's a lot of rich points for us to grapple with, and we have a room full of people. So I'd like to open it up for questions and comments. If just raise your hand, identify yourself, and we'll take hopefully a couple of comments, come back to the panel, and hopefully do 2 rounds. So I think here in the front, what's first?
Thanks very much. One of the indicators in the index report is talks about something like 1%, and it's probably much higher, but 1% of the world's population is currently on the hook. That there's movements of people who have been displaced or for whatever reason are migrants. Now, I'm wondering if you have found a correlation or what sort of causation there actually might be between these movements of people and the level of peace within the various countries who were measured, because one of the key elements of peace or peacefulness is domestic tranquility. And one way to stir the pot is to have people knocking on your door who you either don't know or have somehow demonized or are definitely at least concerned about.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Allie Kane. I work at Crows Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights. My question is for Michelle. I know that you mentioned part of this report is looking at how peace is impacted by other countries' interactions with one another. And given the current, and I guess in the last year, the political instability in the U.S., have you seen this have a significant impact on certain regions or certain countries? I know you mentioned Syria was one of the countries that are the countries that have the lowest level of peace, but have you seen this have a large impact in Latin America and in Europe? Thank you.
Thanks. I think David at the back.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a really fascinating discussion. I also are a member state, so from Australia, and worked closely with Vanessa on all of these issues over the last several years, and really entirely endorsed the analysis that she gave about where the conversation is at on the member state side. I wanted to sort of underscore one really important ingredient here, which is that member states have approved UN bodies to advance implementation of at least a large number of very ambitious recommendations. So I think that means, on this question of political will, the political will is there. Also on the question of the clarity of direction, where do we actually go to try to get better at prevention? That clarity is also there at the moment. And if I put it in sort of 4 themes, I think the idea of moving towards more coherence across the UN, better use of partnerships with outside bodies like the World Bank, better ability to optimise the preventive capacities of all parts of the system, and also the focus at the field level. So I think this report helps us with at least 3 of the challenges I see in the conversation we're having at the moment. One of them is there's still a notion out there that prevention can't be measured. You still hear that viewpoint from time to time, because if you've done it successfully, then you won't know because nothing happened. But actually, this kind of indicator approach really helps us make headway on that and get into a more specific and quantifiable space. I think one of the other challenges we have is that member states in the UN system tend to look at each other a little bit for the next move, rather than seeing how each can advance things within their own capacity. And I think the third one is, at the moment, there's a bit of a notion perhaps that UN reform will save us. So I think on all 3 of those, this report's a big help. The first one, as I said, because it enables us to actually do the measurement. But the other 2, because of the fact that it helps us understand the change of mindset that's needed. It's not just a set of structural changes, it's not just moving a few boxes around, but actually a whole different approach for really everyone who's involved in this space, whether member states or on the UN side. And I think it really opens up the space to actually quantify the relationship between development and peace. Move us a little bit past the old cliche that there is no development without peace, there's no peace without development. But how much are they related? This analysis helps us move there. So really my question, and I think it's got elements across the panel, what can you do, what can we do to embed this analysis and its implications into the day-to-day practice, both with member states and in the UN system? Thanks.
Great, thanks. I think there was, we can take these last 2 hands at the back and then come back to the panel.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lockhart, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Fordham University. And perhaps for that reason, your comments, Susanna, resonated with me, especially the concerns about being able to credibly commit to prevention. So if you're going to have credible prevention, you need a credible commitment. And I was just interested in what the rest of the panel had to say about ways that can be institutionalized within the UN. And to deal with, I think, several of the panelists mentioned kind of the political resistance. This isn't just a technocratic concern, but also an inherently political issue. And kind of related to that, more the politics of international organizations. There was one comment, Vanessa, you made about the zero-sum concerns about attention on conflict prevention versus development, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate that on how you've seen that play out and how it might be addressed. Thank you.
Yeah. My name is James Rowley. I work for the UN and I'm a lecturer at Columbia on peace building. So I just wanted to build on the last couple comments and perhaps inject a note of optimism here. We all know how difficult prevention is. We don't have to go further than the United States to see how difficult it has been to get governments to engage on disaster risk reduction. However, as the economic and financial, human, and political costs of not investing in disaster risk reduction became more apparent, I think you're beginning to see a significant shift towards much greater attention and priority being put in that area. Now, granted, political conflict is a much more sensitive area, but let's also look at the progress over the last few years. We have not only the United Nations Secretary General positing prevention and positive peace as his priority, the member states, General Assembly and Security Council signed off on this agenda a few years ago. Now, of course, we can be cynical and completely dismiss those resolutions, but why should we? We have the SDGs. There's a lot of material to permit valid engagement with member states at the national level on prevention. And I also would like to underscore, and of course this may not apply to the most authoritarian countries in the world, for many countries, prevention and the principles and actions that surround that are in the interest of a sovereign state. So, again, without being romantically optimistic about how easy this agenda is, I think we need to see the progress and the opportunities that have unfolded in the last couple of years. And linked to that, if I might, I think it would be very interesting to hear from Michelle, not only about the excellent work that the IEP is doing at the global level with these studies, but how they're taking these studies on the road at the national level in some of the most difficult contexts that one can imagine, to allow not us, the international community, we merely support peace building. We're not the doers. It's a country, people at the country level who are the doers, but helping citizens in countries that are in terrible conflict, Libya being an example, to unpack positive peace and negative peace and really work on those issues, which I see even in these difficult contexts is a great way of building a new generation of peace builders.
Great, thank you. I think we'll come back to the panel for some responses, hopefully short responses so we can address the last few questions on the floor. So I'll start with you, Vanessa.
Great, thank you. I think there was one specific question posed to me, but maybe I can speak to a couple. I mean, I just to say, I very much appreciated and agreed with what Susanna had to say after I did. In terms of the question of kind of the zero-sum thinking, I think we see it play out the most when we get into discussions of peace and development, the nexus, right? This sense, and I think some of it is motivated through like sums, thinking about money and actually resources flowing to different areas of work. And so we know from evidence that, if you look at the institutions that deliver security, justice, jobs, kind of what the peace building and state building goals of the G7 plus, those institutions receive the lowest investments in terms of overall ODA. And so at a certain point when you're talking about investing more in prevention, you're talking about investing more in these types of institutions, there is a call for more funding to go into certain types of institutions. And in a climate where we don't see massive new announcements of official development assistance, there is a tension. There's a sense that you're taking that money away from other areas that are also equally deserving. And of course, if we're going to implement the SDGs, we need a lot more financing overall. There's also, I think, a kind of baskets of countries kind of thinking that if you focus too much on certain types of countries, then if you think about conflict-affected countries as one category of countries, then the countries that aren't conflict-affected but have huge amounts of poor people will somehow not, miss out on a new trend in investments in prevention. I think these are a lot of real strongman arguments, but I've heard all of them employed in the UN. And certainly, the sustaining peace resolutions were plenary General Assembly resolutions. But in our efforts to then embed them into the kind of the work of the various different committees of the UN, we've had mixed success. And I think where it's been the hardest is in the second committee, which deals with development. And that's where we've seen a lot of this language very heavily caveated about not diverting funds from development, and development is a central goal of itself, and things like that. And I think some of these concerns are genuine, and some of these concerns are instrumentalized for other purposes, and it's not for me to diagnose which are which. I want to pick up on one thing that the gentleman said about prevention and getting investments in things like disaster risk reduction. I think one thing that we have not done very well as the international system when we talk about prevention is look below the kind of the state level and look at the subnational level. And I think that's where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, whether it's work done through municipalities or through kind of state governments or whatever kind of subdivisions, administrative subdivisions different countries have, and something where I would like to see us as a community invest further and really, because also countries are not monolithic themselves, and when you're looking at the actors that you can and can't work with, we spend a lot of time focused on kind of elite level politics and politicians, and not enough time focusing on either grassroots or the work being done by kind of local governments and and formal and informal kind of government structures. I'll leave it there because I want to hear what everyone else has to say.
So I'll first answer some of the more technical questions related to the measures and the analysis. The first one was about the impact of refugees and displacement within countries, within host countries. And so just, a couple of comments on some of the relationships that we see. We have seen this massive shift of population. Obviously, the Syrian conflict is a primary driver of the increase in refugees. But you also see countries like Colombia, which has extremely high levels of internal displacement. So it's not always the type of movements that capture the media attention. What we've seen in Europe is that Eastern European countries have gotten more peaceful. Western European countries in general have gotten less peaceful. So we're seeing a conflicting dynamic there, which I think is somewhat interesting. It's stabilizing a little bit the score in Europe overall as a region. But the US as a country has gone down in the index. I'll speak to that more in one moment. Europe as a region, as I mentioned, has also gone down in the index. It's not that the indicators reflect any activities. They don't reflect numbers of refugees in host countries. It's refugees by origin countries that are impacted from a methodological standpoint. But we do see rises, for instance, in populism and different political dynamics as a result of these influx of people into certain countries. The score for the U.S. has declined over the past few years. principally due to an increase in measures of political instability and measures of internal conflict, which generally represent a growing partisan divide in the United States. Now, the U.S. relationship diplomatically with its neighbors, with our southern neighbor Mexico, the Mexico score has also been impacted by our rhetoric, any renegotiations of trade agreements, etc., can impact the score on relations with neighboring countries. When we're thinking from a more international standpoint, we can also see changes in scores between, for instance, any rhetoric and language between the U.S. and Russia, or should we see any changes between the U.S. and North Korea and any implementations of nuclear agreements. Those have the ability to impact a country's score in the index. Similarly, a withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, for instance, would negatively impact the U.S. score. And then just to sort of address the question about what IEP is doing to bring these frameworks out into the field, which is probably the right way to characterize that, is that what we're seeing from the research is that what we're trying to understand are complex systems. And how do we nudge these complex systems in a positive direction? And by taking the Pillars of Peace framework and using it to engage people, everyday people, not necessarily political elite or implementers, but to engage people across sectors of society in how they understand the manifestation of these broad pillars of positive peace in their own cultural or national context, will hopefully help increase their understanding of their own peace system. And through these small engagements, perhaps we can start to nudge our peace system forward in a positive direction. So to that end, we have started a series of workshops, which we've done, for instance, with 300 Mexican youth from around the country in partnership with Rotary International. So they came together for 2 days to discuss these different pillars of peace and what does low levels of corruption mean in Mexico or in their particular city. That partnership with Rotary International actually will bring that workshop format to many countries around the world. So we're now planning another one in Colombia. We've done one also with Rotary in Uganda, and that was looking at younger people. And then we worked with UNESCO to bring about 100 Libyan youth from different factions within the country to Tunisia for a few days of workshops. And what we've done with the Libya workshops has been quite interesting because we're actually implementing surveys around them as well to try to assess if trust between different groups and cohesion between different groups has shifted at all over the course of participating in these workshops. And for that one with Libya, there was also some funding attached to help put forward certain projects that were developed as a result of thinking through those different pillars. So that's just an example of what we're trying to do to take positive peace into a more operational sense. What we've found is that it's a very neutralizing way to discuss issues, and that engagement and spark of discussion can be just as valuable. So I think about those things for the comment about, how do we start to embed these in our everyday lives. And IEP remains committed to trying to be the broad measurers. So we'll never be the program implementers, but we hope that these frames can start to shift the way people are thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I think two reactions. One, just on this political issue, my impression, my approach is the further away you are from the crisis, the less political it is. So I see us from Cameroon to Indonesia to over the last decades, where if you're far enough out from a crisis, you have a much wider kind of landscape of options to call upon, and they're to do with economic measures and you know, productivity, public information, social policy, and so forth. A much broader set of options to try and manage these dynamics. And then, as you get closer and closer to, due to inaction, as Vanessa said, as you get closer and closer to the crisis, I see the options narrow, and then it becomes immensely political and immensely sensitive. Well, it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it becomes almost impossible to act, or apparently. And so I don't think it has to be political. I think the notion of preventing conflict is inherently political, because it is about access and power and justice, etc. But to implement a prevention strategy doesn't mean necessarily being a political actor. I think if you're smart and far enough out, then your breadth of action is just so much broader and so much easier. And in the UN, we know this. That's where you're going to get the traction. It's in ECOSOC where we need to take this agenda. It's where the development discussion goes, and that we have to raise our expectations of the Economic and Social Council. Because these are generational issues, these are not short-term ones. In terms of behavioural change, institutionalising David's comments and James and actually Sarah, one thought, which is on financing of this. Firstly, I don't think we need a separate portfolio of prevention projects. I think the secret will be in figuring out, in a way, how to introduce a prevention dimension into some of our mainstream work. And I always think of the Global Environment Facility as a really clever experience, where they looked at the incremental costs of a development project, an energy choice, for example, and what more would it cost to choose a more cleaner technology option. And it was often more expensive for an energy plant to take a better choice. So the Global Environment Facility stepped in to pay for the incremental cost of making a better decision for the environment, a better choice. And I kind of dream about some kind of prevention mechanism that comes in there, the incremental cost of a good development project going from one that is a sound development project, let's say in municipal development or social protection, that introduces a preventative dimension into it. How can we pay for that incremental cost? That, I think, would be magic. And finally, on the financing, though, I think we need to figure out a way of taking a little bit of the process of allocating money out of the hands of decision makers in a kind of weird way. I'll explain what I mean there. Because as someone pointed out, I think, James, if you've got nothing to show because you've been successful, this is a terribly difficult thing to raise money for. But in the past, there's been very good thinking about, for example, in DFID in the UK, about the principle that if you spend this much money on humanitarian response in a given year, then you should automatically set aside a percentage for preparedness and prevention. This is in disaster risk reduction. This logic that, and of course it makes complete intuitive sense, right? That of course you should. And they kind of institutionalized it for a while. They bound their hands of the ministers and said, this is an administrative decision. When you spend $100 on prevention, on response after a disaster, $5 will be credited to this preparedness account automatically. And I think there's something there, because of course there's a lot of competition over resources, there's never enough, and if you wait for decision makers to build up a stockpile of money for prevention, I don't think it'll ever happen in my lifetime. So how can we find a clever way, a logical way, an intuitive way of binding our hands so that stockpile of money, investment for prevention grows organically as a function of all of our failure? Because, of course, is it a function of how much you spend on peace building, for example? Or is it a function of how much we put into the humanitarian appeals every year? There must be an intuitive way of connecting these two that is logical, simple, defensible to taxpayers, and will build some kind of an investment fund for these ideas.
This is fascinating, and I think that I want to kind of clarify a couple of things in response to a few questions. I'm not arguing that prevention shouldn't be a goal and that there hasn't been significant political movement. What I'm arguing is that prevention does not implement itself, that there have to be some big questions asked about how do you get it from the policy level to the implementation and what needs to change in order for that to happen. And so in relation to development, if we take the kind of development box here, the question becomes, what is it to do development preventively? And what's the line? You know, is just doing good development that's focused on mitigating exclusion and facilitating inclusion, right? Essentially rights-based development. Rights-based development is fundamentally about prevention, right? And so is that the frame that you need to take? And is that more palatable to everyone because they can put that frame on it and say, okay, well, this isn't being political because maybe I'm not comfortable with being political, but if I put rights-based approaches to development, right, then, or rights-based approaches to programming, then that falls within my wheelhouse and I'm comfortable essentially doing the same thing that you're doing, right? Whatever frame it is that fits and that gets and that addresses the kind of bureaucratic competition which will always exist no matter which bureaucracy you're part of, then use the frame that works. I think the question for me really becomes, are the people at the field level being given the support to actually take the risks that they need to take? And that's extremely important because the people, you know, the success cases, which I have studied many of, the success cases are when individuals take risks, when they actually try to innovate, and when they themselves engage in, whether you want to call it political or not, but they understand the dynamics of the context, the potential drivers of violence, and they do something that may actually challenge the status quo to actually mitigate them, right? Who is empowering, enabling, and supporting those actors? And that is not immediate in a bureaucracy that is as large as the UN or USAID or any international institution doing this work. And so really taking this field level empowerment seriously and asking what that means, what support people need to have in order to act consistently preventively, and if you act consistently preventively, then your commitment becomes credible, right? So rather than worrying about, let me make sure that I'm always demonstrating my credibility by saying things over and over, that's one way of demonstrating it, but it's also about empowering people to actually consistently take a certain type of action where they are able to engage in a way that mitigates rather than reinforces potential drivers of conflict.
Great, thanks, Susanna. I think unfortunately we have run out of time and have to end the discussion now, but I know there are a few questions and I encourage you to come and engage with the panel afterwards so we can continue the discussion. I think that from today's discussion we've heard a lot about the importance of measuring peace at this global and national level, and that it really allows us to assess the social, political, and economic factors that create peace in a society. But we've also heard that peace is more than just the absence of violence, and it must include these measures and aspects of what people believe builds up peace in their societies and the resiliencies that they hold and how we can try as the international community to support that. And the Global Peace Index brings us both peace measures of positive peace as well as the different states of peace in societies. So as we move forward, trying to take the sustaining peace agenda and framework into practice and operationalize these points, the Global Peace Index provides us somewhat of a roadmap to try and overcome and address a lot of these questions. So with that, I'd like to thank the Institute for Economics and Peace for the partnering on this event today, for the panelists for taking the time to provide this valuable input, and for all of you for joining us here today.
那加拿大大学哪个地方？一个加拿大地大学，有个加拿大大学，你来，有的。
Hi, my name is Thomas Iannino. I just recently graduated with a degree and I'm working with the Global Partnerships Forum. I was just wondering, I found what you were talking about very fascinating. I was just wondering if you have a card or anything. So I could just Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.